In 1860, a woman died giving birth in Moscow. Her husband didn't bury her. Instead, he sold her corpse, and the corpse of their dead baby, to a scientist who mummified them both and put them on display in a museum. For the next 100 years, her preserved body was exhibited in circuses, freak shows, and carnival sideshows across Europe and America. Thousands of people paid money to stare at her mummified corpse. In 1976, her body was stolen from a warehouse in Norway. When police found it 3 years later, they didn't even know who she was. It wasn't until 2013, 153 years after her death, that Julia Pastrana was finally buried. But here's what makes this story truly horrifying. Julia Pastrana wasn't dead when her exploitation began. For years before her death, she was displayed on stages across the world as the Ape Woman, the Baboon Lady, the Ugliest Woman Alive. She was examined by doctors who declared her half human, half orangutan. She was marketed as a creature from a tribe that mated with bears. And the man who profited most from her suffering? Her husband. The man who claimed to love her, who married her to control her earnings, and who, after her death, replaced her with another woman who looked just like her. This is the story of Julia Pastrana, and it's one of the cruelest examples of human exploitation in history. Julia Pastrana was born in 1834 in a small settlement in Sinaloa, Mexico. From the moment of her birth, she was different. Her entire body, face, arms, legs, torso, was covered in thick, coarse black hair. Her jaw was enlarged and protruding. Her gums were overgrown, pushing her teeth outward in a way that made her mouth appear almost animal-like. Today we know she had hypertrichosis, a rare genetic condition that causes excessive hair growth all over the body. It affects roughly 1 in a billion people. Combined with gingival hyperplasia, Julia's appearance was so unusual that many people struggled to see her as human. But she was human. Completely, undeniably human. And she was brilliant. What happened to Julia in her first years of life is unclear. Multiple versions of her story exist, many of them fabricated later by the men who exploited her. But here's what we know. One version says Julia's mother belonged to an indigenous Mexican tribe. After Julia was born, her appearance caused fear and superstition. Some accounts claim her mother was cast out. Others say she fled voluntarily to protect her daughter. Either way, Julia and her mother ended up living in isolation, hiding in the mountains. Local villagers called Julia the Wolf Woman. When Julia was still very young, sources vary on exactly when, she was taken from her mother and placed in the care of Pedro Sanchez, the governor of Sinaloa. Whether this was an adoption out of kindness or something closer to purchase is unclear. But Julia became a servant in the governor's household. And this is where something remarkable happened. Instead of being hidden away, Julia was educated. She learned to read and write, rare for any woman in 1840s Mexico, let alone a girl with her appearance. She learned multiple languages. She studied music. She sang. She danced. People who met her described her as intelligent, charming, kind, and surprisingly charismatic despite her appearance. But Julia's education wasn't about kindness. It was about marketability, because Pedro Sanchez knew that Julia was valuable. And eventually, he sold her. In 1854, a 20-year-old Julia Pastrana was brought to the United States. The exact circumstances vary depending on the source. Some say an American showman named M. Rates discovered her and convinced her to come to America voluntarily, promising fame and fortune. Others say Pedro Sanchez sold her directly to a promoter. Another account claims a customs official named Francisco Sepúlveda purchased her and brought her across the border. What we know for certain is this. By December 1854, Julia Pastrana was standing on a stage at Gothic Hall on Broadway in New York City, being advertised as the marvelous hybrid and the bear woman from the wilds of Mexico. The posters were grotesque. They claimed Julia came from a tribe of root diggers who lived in caves and resembled apes. They suggested her people mated with bears and orangutans. They called her a missing link between humans and animals. None of it was true. But truth didn't matter. What mattered was spectacle, and people came in droves. Julia's stage act was actually quite sophisticated. She sang Spanish folk songs. She danced the Highland Fling. She spoke multiple languages and engaged with the audience in Q&A sessions, answering questions about her life with intelligence and grace. But the crowds didn't care about her talents. They came to stare, to gawk, to confirm their suspicions that she was some kind of monster. She was given a series of degrading stage names: the Ape Woman, the Baboon Lady, the Ugliest Woman Alive, the nondescript. And then came the medical examinations. Julia's manager, a man named Theodore Lent, had her examined by doctors and scientists. Not to help her, not to understand her condition, but to generate publicity. Dr. Alexander B. Mott examined Julia and certified, falsely, that she was half human and half orangutan. Other doctors agreed. One declared her a distinct species. These were educated men, scientists, doctors, and they were willing to lie, or genuinely believed, that Julia Pastrana was not fully human. But not everyone was fooled. Samuel Nealon, Jr., a comparative anatomist from the Boston Society of Natural History, examined Julia and declared, "She is a perfect woman, performing all the functions of her sex." The surgeon Francis Buckland visited her in London in 1857 and wrote, "I believe her true story was that she was simply a deformed Mexican Indian woman." He described her face as hideous, but noted that she had an exceedingly good figure, a sweet voice, great taste in music and dancing, and could speak 3 languages. Even Charles Darwin weighed in after her death, writing, "Julia Pastrana, a Spanish dancer, was a remarkably fine woman, but she had a thick, masculine beard and a hairy forehead. From the redundancy of her teeth, her mouth projected, and her face had a gorilla-like appearance. A remarkably fine woman." That's what she was, a woman, not an ape, not a hybrid. A woman with a genetic condition, being exploited for profit. And the man profiting most was Theodore Lent. Theodore Lent was Julia's manager, and eventually her husband. But make no mistake, this was not a love story. Lent saw Julia as a business asset. She was generating enormous revenue. Crowds packed theaters to see her. She was famous across America and Europe, and Lent controlled every aspect of her life. He didn't allow her to go out during the day. Being seen in public for free, he reasoned, would hurt ticket sales. So Julia was confined to hotel rooms and backstage areas, only emerging when it was time to perform. She had few friends. Most people saw her as a curiosity, not a person. But there were exceptions. While touring in Vienna, Julia became close with an actress named Frederica Gossman. Julia once told her, "He loves me for myself." Gossman later wrote that Julia had a light fog of sadness that always hung over her. The German circus owner, Hermann Otto, met Julia in Vienna and had a long conversation with her. He later wrote in his memoir, "A monster to the whole world, an abnormality put on display for money, someone who had been taught a few artistic turns like a trained animal. But for the few who knew her better, she was a warm, feeling, thoughtful, spiritually very gifted being with a sensitive heart and mind. And it affected her very deeply in her heart with sadness, having to stand beside people instead of with them, and to be shown as a freak for money, not sharing any of the everyday joys in a home filled with love. So why did Lent marry her? Competition. By the late 1850s, Julia was famous. Other showmen, including P.T. Barnum, were trying to recruit her. Lent was terrified of losing his most profitable asset. So in 1857, he married her. Now she couldn't leave. Now he legally owned her earnings. Now he controlled her completely. Did Julia love him? It's hard to say. She told friends she believed he loved her, but Lent's actions suggest otherwise. Years later, after Julia's death, Lent would marry another woman with a similar appearance and force her to perform under the name Zenora Pastrana, marketing her as Julia's little sister. He would die in a Russian mental asylum, screaming naked on a bridge, ripping up banknotes. But that comes later. For now, Julia was married, and in 1859, she became pregnant. March 1860, Moscow, Russia. Julia Pastrana went into labor. She was 26 years old, standing just 4 feet 5 inches tall, and her body was already struggling under the strain of pregnancy. Hypertrichosis and gingival hyperplasia don't just affect appearance. They're often linked to other developmental abnormalities that can complicate childbirth. The labor was long, difficult, agonizing. And when the baby finally came, it was clear something was wrong. The boy was enormous, far larger than a typical newborn. And like his mother, he was covered in thick black hair. His facial features mirrored Julia's, the protruding jaw, the overgrown gums. He was alive, breathing. For 35 hours, Julia held her son, and then he died. 5 days later, Julia died too, likely from postpartum complications, possibly from infection or hemorrhaging. Her last words, according to legend, were, "Are they happy? Because I know I have been loved for my own sake." It's a beautiful sentiment, almost too beautiful. It feels like something someone would invent to make the story more poignant. But whether or not she actually said those words, one thing is clear. Julia Pastrana died believing she had been loved. Theodore Lent, meanwhile, was devastated. Not because he had lost his wife and child, because he had lost his source of income. And then he had an idea. Theodore Lent sold his wife's corpse and his dead son's corpse to Professor Ivan Sokolov of Moscow University. Sokolov was an expert in taxidermy and preservation. Lent commissioned him to preserve the bodies so they could be displayed in the university's anatomical institute. But Sokolov didn't just preserve them. He perfected them. Using a technique that blended mummification with taxidermy, Sokolov created something horrifying. The bodies looked alive. Julia's skin retained its color. Her hair was intact. Her eyes, glass replacements, seemed to stare out at viewers with an unsettling, lifelike quality. When Lent saw the results, he realized he'd made a mistake selling them. So he bought them back. And for the next 20 years, Theodore Lent toured Europe and the United States with the mummified corpses of his dead wife and infant son, displaying them in theaters, circuses, and freak shows. People paid to stare at Julia Pastrana's dead body the same way they had paid to stare at her living one. She was still performing, even in death. A few years after Julia's death, Lent found another woman. Her name was Marie Bartel, and like Julia, she had hypertrichosis, excessive hair growth covering her body. Lent saw an opportunity. He approached Marie's father and asked to marry her, promising he would never exhibit her. The father agreed. Lent lied. Within months, Marie was on stage, performing under the name Zenora Pastrana. Advertisements claimed she was Julia Pastrana's younger sister. Audiences came to see the family perform. Except Julia and her baby were mummified corpses, and Marie was a living woman forced to dance beside the preserved bodies of her predecessor. For years, Lent toured with Marie and the corpses, amassing a fortune. Then, in the 1880s, after they retired to St. Petersburg, something inside Theodore Lent snapped. One day, he was found screaming naked on a bridge, tearing apart banknotes and throwing them into the river. He was committed to a mental asylum and died shortly after in 1884. Marie sold the bodies of Julia and her baby and returned to Germany. For the next 50 years, Julia Pastrana's mummified corpse was passed from owner to owner, displayed in museums, circuses, and carnival sideshows across Europe and America. By the 1950s, the bodies were in storage, largely forgotten. But in the 1970s, they were put on display again, this time in Sweden and Norway. Public outrage followed. People were horrified that a woman's corpse was still being exhibited for profit more than a century after her death. In 1973, the owner, a man named Hans Lund, placed the bodies in a carnival warehouse near Oslo. On August 12, 1976, someone broke into the warehouse. Julia's body was stolen. Her son's remains were vandalized and destroyed by rats. For 3 years, no one knew where Julia Pastrana's body was. Then, in 1979, police found her mummified corpse in a storage locker. But they didn't know who she was. The body was transferred to the Institute of Forensic Medicine in Oslo, where it sat, unclaimed and unidentified, for over a decade. In 1990, a journalist finally identified her. And that's when the debate began. What do we do with Julia Pastrana's body? For the next 23 years, Julia's remains stayed in storage at the University of Oslo's Department of Anatomy. Activists, artists, and descendants of Julia's family campaigned for her to be returned to Mexico and given a proper burial. Finally, in February 2013, 153 years after her death, Julia Pastrana's body was returned to Sinaloa, Mexico. A Catholic funeral was held. Hundreds of people attended. She was buried in a cemetery near her birthplace. For the first time in over 150 years, Julia Pastrana was at peace. Julia Pastrana's story is often told as a curiosity, a bizarre footnote in the history of freak shows and Victorian-era exploitation. But it's so much more than that. Julia was a woman who was treated as an object her entire life, first as a living spectacle, then as a literal mummified exhibit. She was denied dignity in life and in death. But through it all, she maintained her humanity. She learned, she sang, she danced. She formed friendships. She believed, however naively, that she was loved. And she was more than her appearance. She was intelligent, talented, kind. The people who actually knew her said so. Even Charles Darwin acknowledged she was a remarkably fine woman. Her story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How did so many people, doctors, scientists, audiences, showmen, convince themselves that Julia Pastrana was not fully human? How did her husband justify selling her corpse and touring with it for 20 years? How did museums and circuses continue displaying her body well into the 1970s, an era when we supposedly knew better? And how long did it take for someone to finally say, "This is wrong. She deserves a burial"? Julia Pastrana was exploited in every possible way. But she was not a monster. She was not a hybrid. She was not an ape. She was a woman. And she deserved so much better than the world gave her. If this story moved you or disturbed you, please subscribe to this channel. Every week, we uncover stories of people who were exploited, erased, or forgotten by history. Leave a comment. Do you think the people who displayed Julia's body in the 1970s believed they were doing anything wrong? Or had they just stopped seeing her as human? Thank you for watching. And thank you for remembering Julia Pastrana, not as the Ape Woman, but as a person who deserved dignity, respect, and a peaceful rest.